talk about some cables. Whenever you're recording, initially with your interface, and as long as your recording setup is simple, you're not going to have a whole slew of different types of cables. But it is crazy how quickly it can get complicated and all the cables that you need. Some of the cables look identical. They have the same connector, but they do completely different functions. This is very significant because some of these cables will be digital or analog based on how it's wired, not based on the type of connector it has. How do you know the difference? Keep track of them. Read the packaging it was in when you bought it, and if it doesn't say on the cable, label it. It's the only way. Most cables don't say, so you're going to have to remember in some way. First cable up, TRS cable, sometimes called stereo cable or balanced 1/4 inch. This is, TRS by the way stands for tip ring sleeve. It is this cable here. This cable looks like a guitar cable. This is not a guitar cable. This sends 2 signals, whereas guitar cable sends only 1. Sometimes it's used for connecting monitors, like studio monitors, for stereo sound, or not stereo sound, excuse me, for a balanced sound. Or you could use it to send a stereo signal. But that is the purpose of that cable, not a guitar cable. The guitar cable looks identical. This one's actually rather small. This one's actually for pedals. But nonetheless, same type of cable as you would use for your guitar. This only has 1 ring. This is meant to send 1 signal, not 2 signals. So you would use this for guitar. This is 1/4 inch. Next cable up is a Cat 5 cable. Cat 5 cable, you've probably seen this before. It looks like a telephone connector if you remember the days of plugging your telephone into the wall. We almost don't do that anymore. This type of cable is not quite the same. This is used more often than not for Ethernet, internet connections, network connections on computers. However, there are some companies that are moving to this type of connector for using foot pedals to control amps and that sort of thing. This is actually great because you can transmit all of your data and transmit the power for the pedal. Back in the old days when you had a regular MIDI pedal for your amp, you had to plug it in separate from the amp. Now you don't have to do that. Cat 5 can transmit the power to the pedal and power it. Let's talk about Firewire cable. Firewire cable you may or may not be familiar with. This format is for transmitting large amounts of digital data. Most interfaces are USB, most consumer interfaces, but when you get up to transmitting maybe 8 tracks of recording at one time and that sort of thing, that data becomes too large to transmit over the current USB 2.0. So you might see Firewire instead of USB. Also for transmitting video, 90% of the time they use Firewire or they're switching over to HDMI. This cable here, this is a 6-pin Firewire cable. You can see it's a little, you can kind of get an idea of the size. The significance here, there's 2 types. There's a 4-pin style and a 6-pin style. This is a 4-pin, and you probably can't see it real well, but you can see the significant difference in size. The only difference is the 2 extra pins in the 6 transmit power. Let's talk about 1/8-inch cables, oftentimes called headphone cables. Here's an example of one here. You may notice this has 2 rings. You probably won't notice on the screen here. This is pretty darn tiny. But it has 2 rings just like the tip ring sleeve, the stereo 1/4 inch cable we talked about earlier. This is a headphone cable, a lot of times used for MP3 devices and that sort of thing, as well as the sound card inputs and outputs on your computer. Optical cable. Optical cable is basically fiber optic. You've probably heard this term before. This is basically transmitting data using forms of light. This is actually pretty slick. This is used for transferring digital information. The optical cable is a very, very unique looking cable. It's kind of hard to see here, but it is used a lot of times in new home theater type of equipment. But also there are some high-end interfaces that are using optical data transfer when you're transferring large amounts of digital information. The next connector we're going to talk about is one of these ones you want to be aware of what kind of packaging it came in, what was the purpose of this cable, because this connector the end, is called RCA. You have seen this before. It used to be used for connecting VCRs, any type of analog audio and visual equipment for the longest time used the RCA connector. Well, the RCA connector has been adopted also for transmitting various types of digital data as well. What's the difference? How the cable is wired. You can't go by how it looks. Just because it has a connector doesn't mean it's analog and doesn't mean it can be used in place of digital. You want to make sure you use the right cables. You can damage your gear if you don't. Can't go by the connector. If you bought a digital RCA cable, label it if you don't know. The last cable we're going to talk about is called the XLR cable, more commonly known as the microphone cable. This cable you've probably seen before as well. Here's an example of one you can see. However, this has the same, you can run into the same problem with this cable as you can with the RCA. There is several other formats, digital formats, that use an XLR connector. AES EBU is a particular format, and it's showing up more and more on interfaces. So same thing, know the difference between your mic cables and your digital cables with an XLR connector on the end. That's it for cables. Make sure you keep track of which cables do what. Don't get your analog cables mixed up with your digital cables. We'll also do a bit here where I'll show you the back of an interface that receives several different types of cables, some analog, some digital. You'll see several that we've covered here just a few minutes ago.